Good morning, party people. How's it going this morning? Welcome to our Q&A stream, the last Q&A stream for the next couple of weeks. I'm teaching a weekend class next weekend, doing mastering parameter sniffing on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then after the weekend after that, I think we're going to be in Malibu, California, so taking the weekend off. Helmet is all pretty again. Yes, Jim went and got him detailed and had a wonderful little drive up and down the beach. And I was gonna take a picture of him and put him on Instagram. And then I was like, I ended up getting him a little bit dirty already, just driving pretty quickly. So. Yes. Santa says, yes, look at the light show on the keyboard. I had totally forgot that I could put light shows on, and it seems like such an obvious thing to do when I'm like broadcasting and streaming that I should just leave it up and running doing some kind of light show because they have all kinds of really cool little different light effects that it'll do. So I figured, I'll just leave that up and running so at least it'll give people distraction when the question is boring or unrelated to them. It's just something neat to see. And I don't leave it on 24/7, of course, because it would burn through the battery probably in no time, but kind of fun to have just exactly using a gamer keyboard. Next thing you know, I'll be having those little what are they called? I don't know what the little ears are on the headphones and all that. Jan says about USB on site, you can replace a K8 to K1. I don't even know what you're saying there, but okay, cool. Joris says my daughter loves the rainbow light show. I only got the white LEDs. I didn't get the RGB LED version. I don't think. Cat ears. That's what I was going for, Arthur. You and I, Arthur, we have something in common there. Probably no one else on this stream is like, what? So. I'll go ahead and start adding your questions to the queue. So like Simon, I see your question in there. I'll add that. Eamon, I haven't seen you in a while. Welcome. Drop Table says, good. Next up, gaming chair. I have a Herman Miller Aeron, and I never broadcast with it. Like, it always seems so much more natural to talk with standing up so that I can use my hands and stuff like that. Oh, you want now? So the K1 I didn't like as much. The K1, if I remember right, it didn't have hot swappable keys. Like you couldn't switch the key switches if that was what it was. I'm trying to remember what the gotcha was with the K1, but there was something I didn't like about the K1. I can't quite remember what it was. I should change my white balance just a little bit so that it's not quite so bright inside here. So Neil says, good morning. Good to see you again, Neil, from Durban, South Africa. All right, so let's see. Let's go ahead and get started. We've got one question in the queue. Feel free to type in whatever questions you want, SQL Server related, consulting, whatever. And we'll go through first come, first serve. So first up is Simonot. Simonot says, I found my compat level was at 100. I set it to 130 and noticed some queries up to 500 times faster. I found no regressions. Are there any other considerations? So the thing is, let's say that it makes just 1% of your queries slower. If it makes just 1% of your queries slower, your server runs a lot of different queries. And so 1% of queries going slower can be catastrophic for some businesses if it's especially the 1% of queries that they happen to care really passionately about. So what Microsoft will tell you is that you should, in a dev or staging environment, you should replay your entire workload. You should use tools like the Database Experimentation Assistant, the DEA, like of all the acronyms to pick, the DEA, and then go see whether or not you get any regressions. I don't know anybody who does that. Most people do the same thing that you do. They just go and turn it on at 130 and go see what explodes. So as long as nothing exploded for you, you're good. It's not like you're exposing yourself to any new serious SQL Server bugs or anything like that. It's usually just a query performance problem. Arthur says, Brent, what was the strangest situation with SQL Server that you have ever found yourself with? Strange. I found so many strange situations. I don't know that I've told the story on the stream of me essentially firing a client. This is probably this. Well, okay, so I'll tell you the one that was probably the strangest. So I bought a suit one time because I had to go into a client. This is right when I was getting started doing consulting, and the client said, we'll hire you on as a consultant, but you have to wear a suit. Everyone who comes into these offices wears a suit. And I was real new at consulting, and I thought, okay, maybe that's normal. Maybe some companies, maybe the good jobs require you to wear a suit. So I'm like, okay, I go and get fitted for a suit, get it tailored and all that kind of thing. And I go and show up, and I'm talking to him. It's just one person at this company, just one person, big, huge company. There's only one person that I'm talking to. And it was really clear that I was only supposed to talk to this one person. So I'm talking to this one person, and he says, okay, we got a performance problem. We need to be able to process stock trades faster. I'm like, okay, sure. Let's see what happens. We go and pop open the server, and the very first thing that I go and look at and see is they don't have backups. I'm new at consulting, but I'm like, look, I'm not really comfortable being on a system with stock trades without backups. Can you just go ahead and get backups in? And he goes, no. I'm like, what do you mean, no? What do you mean you can't do backups? And he's like, no, we're only hiring you to fix performance issues. We're not hiring you to fix anything related to backups. And I'm like, okay, but if something goes wrong, I'm just human. I could accidentally drop a table. I could highlight the wrong thing in SSMS. Someone else could be working and doing something that I'm not aware of. I said, we got to have some kind of backups here. And he said, no, we're only going to pay you to improve performance. Don't worry about anything else. And I said, okay. Here's the deal. I'm probably not a good fit. I said, I will only work on a system if there is backups. I'm really sorry. It's just me. I'm sure that you'll find another consultant who's willing to do this. I'm just not willing to do it. I'm going to draw the line here. I like y'all. You seem to be nice people, but I'm going to walk away. And he's like, "It's your last chance. Would you like to pay you to do this?" And I'm like, "That's okay. Don't worry about it. You don't owe me $1 for this. I'm just going to go ahead and leave." So I left. And a few weeks later, I get posted, stuff from an attorney. I can't remember if it was via email or mail. Basically saying, does the company owe you anything? Does this company that you contracted with, do they owe you anything? And I said, nope, not $1. It's totally okay. Well, it turned out that they'd gone under, that there'd been all kinds of accounting fraud or whatever. And from that moment, I was like, they could have been throwing me under the bus. I don't think so, but they could have been setting me up to go, here, we'll get this guy in here, have him fix performance. He'll trash the server. We'll actually trash the server behind the scenes. We'll pin the blame on him, and then we'll say that all this data loss was on him, not us. And so from that moment forward, I just was like, oh, I'm never going to bother. Before I'll even sign a contract with anybody, I have to have data proving that there's backups. Don't want anybody's money without that. I don't care. And you'd be surprised at how often now companies will say, oh, we didn't know we didn't have backups, or that database isn't important. I'm like, okay, great, drop it. Drop that database, and then we'll be totally okay. All right, so let's see here. Next up, let's add a couple of questions over to the queue. Hold on a second here. Add that in. And then, you know what else I need to add in? I need to, just a second here, I need to get my Twitch chat out so that I can add your YouTube stuff to there it is. Add your YouTube, because some of you are putting in chats from while I play Zelda. Now some of you are adding in chats from YouTube, so let me go get those. Just a second here, because I think that was Santa says, does changing the compat level blow out the plan cache? Yes. Let's see here. Let me grab. There was one other one that came in from YouTube, and let me go grab that. YouTube. Whoopsie. YouTube there. And then let me grab another. Well, I'll stop there. Actually, I'll only take questions via Twitch from today, just to make it easy. So let's go put that in there and see what we've got next. Contact administrator says, hi Brent, from the last 2 months, I'm observing a lot of SOS and page IO latch wait types. How can they be interconnected? No other wait type is this much prominent. So I talk about these in my mastering server tuning class, and I spend an hour on each of those wait types, so it's tough for me to give you an answer in like 60 seconds. But the short answer is SOS means queries are burning a lot of CPU. Page IO latch means that queries are reading a lot of data from disk. If you have both of those, my guess is that you might be hosting your SQL Server on something akin to a laptop, that you may not have enough horsepower. Now, the answer isn't necessarily throwing more horsepower at the problem. The answer may also be tuning your queries or indexes. And that's what we go into in the class, is figuring out which queries are the most responsible, which indexes are the most responsible, and then how you go about figuring out whether you should do query or index tuning or throw more horsepower at the box. Just make sure you've got at least as much horsepower as my laptop for starters. So my laptop's like 8 or 12 CPU cores and 64 gigs of RAM. Generally speaking, I don't troubleshoot SQL servers with less than 8 cores. I'm like, go get yourself an iPad and, go from there. Next up, let's see here. Who have we got next? Add a couple of things over here to the queue. Next up is Darius. Darius says, first consulting job before me, do you have some analysis document templates from where I can put in my analysis and send those to the clients? What should it contain? Yes, if you search on brentozar.com for how to do a health check. So let's go over and take a look. So if I fire open Google and I go search for Brent Ozar health check, I have examples out there like doing your free SQL Server health check. There's several examples out there on the web. So I've also got a performance check. So in here, how to do a free SQL Server health check, doing your free SQL Server health check, all kinds of stuff like that. So go Google for there, and you've got sample documents out there that you can reuse, the whole 9 yards. And next up, you know what I'm going to do too is I'm going to add in a little blurb. Watch this. Let's grab, copy, and then come back over here to this. And let's paste this in. Let's light this up and say, I'm going to change the text over here. I'm going to change this to say, to ask questions, ask on twitch.tv Brent Ozar. There we go. So that way I will make it clear to folks that they can only ask on Twitch, not YouTube. Because I won't copy paste the questions back and forth. I got a really cool framework to just copy paste. Surly Dev, hey, welcome to the, see, I was only because you weren't here. I was even telling them, hey, sorry, you're not allowed to ask questions on YouTube. All right, well, in that case, I'm going to turn that back off then. Okay, there we go. Let's see here. Next up, Eamon says, what's your advice for a new blog site? Is it still valid for a new SQL Server blog site, or should it be on a new... The blog that you write should be on the pain point that you want to solve, the pain that you want to solve for your career. So if you want to solve SQL Server problems, you should blog about SQL Server. If you want to solve cloud problems, you should blog about cloud. Basically, think of it as every time you blog, you're buying advertisements. You're buying advertisements to get people to talk to you about your services. Now, there are certainly lots of other reasons to blog as well, to help the community, to document what you know. But if you, because I say this because I know Eamon, if you want to build up your consulting and build up your reputation, think of it as buying advertisements with your time. If you're spending 1 hour on a weekend that you're going to go and build a blog post, then think of it as, say it's $100 an hour, you're about to buy $100 worth of advertising. What do you want that $100 worth of advertising to sell people? So that'll kind of help you there. Next up, I Drive Faster says, I had a friend, yes, timeout occurred waiting for a buffer latch, no disk errors, other things I should have looked at. So this is getting pretty detailed. I would probably post that over at dba.stackexchange.com just because it's kind of beyond the scope of what I would want to try and tackle during just a general QA. Next up, Zaki says, I'm not really a database administrator, neither am I, but I wanted to ask, what are the differences between relational databases and Hadoop? Great question. So with stuff like Hadoop, it's much more about how do I scale out across all kinds of servers and just dump all kinds of data that's not necessarily structured. That somebody was just getting all kinds of wild data like text logs from web servers. Like web servers are continually compiling all kinds of text logs, getting all kinds of text logs in. And then when you ask a question, you're willing to wait some time while this army of cheap robots goes and analyzes all this unstructured stuff to give you an answer. Relational databases tend to be about things where you need an answer within milliseconds. And in order to get that answer within milliseconds, you're prepared to organize the data ahead of time. Like you're going to have very strict rules about what kinds of data you're going to accept, what format they're going to be in, and you're not going to change that wild and loose. So Hadoop and HDFS, more about random unstructured questions that take a long time to answer. Relational databases tend to be about very quick questions with very structured data. Hopefully that explains it. Next up, Clunky says, I don't understand why I'm troubleshooting a query that has problems. If I place an option recompile, everything's okay. If I free it, da-da-da-da-da-da. So that's parameter sniffing. Yeah, you nailed it, parameter sniffing. And so if you want to learn more about that, I have a class called Fundamentals of Parameter Sniffing. It's $95 and you can learn all kinds of things about how that works. Next up, Hirish says, how does disk encryption work with SQL? Is there any performance overhead? Okay, there are a few different layers at which you can put in encryption. You can have SQL Server do it. So when SQL Server goes to write an 8K page to disk, or whatever page, depending on off-row data, whatever, when SQL Server goes and writes that data to disk, also when it reads it back up, there's some CPU overhead for SQL Server to encrypt that data. Or if you have the storage do it for you on disk encryption, then the storage manages the overhead of that. The problem with storage doing the encryption is that generally whenever any database server connects to that storage, they're going to be able to see the data unencrypted. So it's not really that secure. It just checks a box for auditors. Really, if you want serious encryption, what you end up doing is having the application encrypt it, and you never give the keys to SQL Server. You don't want SQL Server to even know how to decrypt that stuff. Like Social Security numbers, SQL Server shouldn't need to unencrypt that data for things like replication or whatever. Let's see. Next up, Zaki says, I had the same situation you said earlier where I was tasked at integrating Stripe with PHP. I saw a vulnerability with another component of the PHP app, but the client said not to mess with those components. I ended up rejecting the project. The great example of that, a really good example of that is you really only have one reputation. Throughout the course of your life, you only have one reputation, and if you take on a piece of work that ends up getting hacked or has serious security problems or loses data or is ripping off personal data from people, you only have one reputation, and if word gets out that you were the administrator or you were the developer who was involved in that terrible project, when people Google for your name, they'll see it. Like if you were one of those people who was involved in Enron or Arthur Andersen, any of those covers up years ago, or what was the Cambridge Analytics, those people's names are out there if you go and Google for them. You only get one reputation, and so I'm kind of like, it's not really worth it to me to take on a project where there could be personal data loss or things like that. Next up, we'll see. Wet Seal says, did you ever get a reaction from Microsoft on your blog post? There's a bottleneck in Azure SQL DB storage throughput. So Microsoft and I have this interesting relationship. And thank you, Surly Dev. I'm going to give a couple of shout outs to you through the course of today. Surly Dev is the heroic, most patient, hardworking person who's sitting here helping make sure all of these questions and answered questions get put into the queue. Surly Dev does that out of the love of his own heart for the community, so you should all thank Surly Dev for his wonderful patience and diligence in working with your questions. Having said that, now I forgot what the question was. Damn it! Why do I keep doing that? What the heck was that question? Oh man, it was wet seal. Wet seal. Where was it? I'm going to scroll back up in the chat logs and see if I can see it. Dang it. Oh, that's going to kill me not seeing where it was. I'm going to scroll down and see if I see, because I think it was wet seal. Who knows? All right, well, wet seal, ask it again. Whenever you think of it, ask it again. And oh, if they reply to my blog post. Thank you, Jackie. I appreciate it. So Microsoft and I have this tricky relationship. They won't talk to me very often. They seem to be very walled off. They're like, screw Brent, we're not going to talk to him. But then anytime I post something, they go diligently working, trying to fix whatever it was that I was complaining about. So after I published this blog post, nobody from Microsoft talked to me, but then all of a sudden they start raising the limits. They start documenting and raising the limits for Azure SQL DB throughput. Now, they still didn't raise it higher than a USB 3 thumb drive, but at least they acknowledged that there was a problem and they started working towards it. I always find it mildly amusing that Microsoft refused. They're like, don't tell him we saw it. No, don't. Shh. Try not to look at him. He's scary. I'm like, oh, come on. I'm just a blogger, and I'm trying to point stuff out, and I can't get that stuff out. Next up, Abuse Sysadmin says, what performance hit is there for row-level security? For me, generally, I'll just tell people, do you need row-level security? Okay, then you have to put it in. And it doesn't really matter what the overhead is. It's kind of like airbags in a car. You never hear people going, well, how much slower do the airbags make me? The federal law says that you have to have airbags in your car. Now shut up and put the airbags in your car. So that's all. It's not really negotiable. It's not like I can say, well, we need to protect our user data, but it's just unacceptably slow in order to protect it. It doesn't matter. You just got to do it. Suck it up and do it. And I'm not saying row-level security is the right answer. It just depends on you working with the end users and developers and project admins to figure out what the right solution is. But don't go put something on for security if you don't need it. Don't go putting something on to slow your server down if you don't need it. But do put on the things that you do need. There you go. Let's see. Next up is N. Reiling, who has a wonderful little bonsai tree there for his avatar, or her avatar. It says, how many cores and RAM do you give your Windows VM on the Mac Pro? I usually give 4 cores and 32 gigs of RAM because I have in my Mac Pro I have 16 cores, 32 with hyper-threading on, and 96 gigs of RAM. Normally I just do 4 cores, but if I need to do parallelism demos, I'll do 8 cores because 4 versus 8 exhibits slightly different parallelism behavior. Mr. Wormhole says, what is T-SQL and P-SQL? So when you're a vendor like Microsoft or Oracle or Postgres or whatever, you sometimes want to ship more features than the official standard supports. Like you're like, check this out. I got this cool way of doing .NET code inside of SQL Server. So you develop your own flavor of the structured query language so that you can ship features before they're into the official standard. When you use those features as a developer, then that also makes you locked into that one vendor. Every now and then I'll hear somebody go, screw it, we're just going to convert our SQL Server application over to Postgres. And I'm like, oh yeah, good luck with that. Because your developers have leveraged so many exclusive features of T-SQL or Oracle's PL/SQL or whatever it is. So if you're just getting started as a developer, try to write ANSI SQL. Try to write SQL that works across more platforms. Not because you're ever going to move your app, but just because it makes you a more flexible developer, makes you be able to jump from one system to another, like between Microsoft and Postgres. Neil asked a question, Microsoft exams, I've never taken them. Not never, but not in the last 10 years. I haven't taken Microsoft exams in the last 10 years because I think they're BS. They're just a joke. Ever since they discontinued the Microsoft Certified Master program, the certifications are all based from Microsoft Learning, who has to make a profit on every single certification that they ship, and they're heavily biased towards the latest and greatest features that don't necessarily have anything to do with what DBAs and developers do on a daily basis. So I remember taking those exams and be like, why are they asking me 20 ways to format XML? What the hell sense does it? No one's ever done this. You don't do this on a daily basis. But they want to ask you questions about new features just because they're trying to market the new features. It's just junk, just garbage. So Zaki says, what's the protocol for storing payment details in a database? Realistically, I would never do this, and I just use a third-party system, but I'm curious on what the protocol is. You know, I try to stay away from security work. It's actually forbidden inside my contract, so I'm not a good person to answer that. But great question. It's one of those where you really need to dot all your I's and cross all your T's and get it perfect, and I just don't have the time to bother with that. Every now and then I'll hear someone say, you should know everything, like generically speaking to experts. Y'all should know everything about SQL Server. You should know security and performance and clustering and high, you know, I'm like, that's not how it works. It's just the product's way too big and too deep. For example, just recently they've shipped availability groups in Kubernetes in the form of big data clusters and R and Python and Java in the database. And if you think you know all of that, you're going to be blown away by every year new stuff getting shipped. So you just can't know everything. You're jack of all trades, master of none. Eamon says, 4 terabytes of data in one instance with an average of 2,000 batch requests a second. What's the best guess for good RAM for that instance? It would depend on what the batch requests a second are actually doing. For example, if they're just selecting ID from table where the primary key is something, you don't need jack for RAM. But the more data that they're selecting, the less sargeable their where clauses are, the more challenging that starts to become. If you don't do any performance tuning, or if you can't afford to, like I've had .coms that simply couldn't afford to, a good starting guess is 2 times the data size. So if you had 4 terabytes worth of data, you would need 8 terabytes worth of RAM. Now, of course, not a lot of folks are willing to do that, so that's where performance tuning comes in. Next up, SRE DevOps says, what do you think about running databases on Kubernetes? It's ridiculously stupid. Now, scaling MySQL could be totally different. I'm a SQL Server guy. Right now, running production SQL Server on Kubernetes is incredibly dumb. Just bizarrely beyond dumb is really stupid. SQL Server doesn't have any kind of tools built in to make it easier to manage production SQL servers on Kubernetes. Failure troubleshooting is an utter nightmare. If you start following people who do SQL Server on Kubernetes on Twitter, they are just vomiting text all over their keyboards all day long about bashing their heads in, trying to get the problems with them fixed. Don't use... It's a great saying in development. Build weird things with boring tools. Build boring things with weird tools. So like for me, if I'm building a production SQL Server application, I'm going to use the straight, normal, predictable type tooling. I'm not going to go off and use something weird. Next up, SQL Santa says, what would your strategy be for managing large tables with focus on good performance? Every now and then, this is the first time I've discussed it in this webcast, but never, ever, 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 never, 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 never say the word large. Never, 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 never. For the rest of your career, you're always going to be working with stuff that's going to feel large to you. So what I'm going to say is, if you said large tables as 10 terabytes, if you're dealing with 10 terabyte sized tables, you're absolutely right. Partitioning is not a good performance improvement. Instead, what you want to do is things like query tuning and index tuning. Partitioning is a loading feature and an archiving feature, but it's not a query performance feature. And Microsoft is really good about saying that in books online. Yeah, J. Cole, yeah, but people don't show up every day like you do, J. Cole. Woohoo! Next up, Toto says, is there a way to get when tables were last updated, inserted, or deleted if there's no true date column? Lots of times people use last update, seek, or scan, but I wanted to know if there's another way. Theoretically, you can read the transaction log. So I used to work for Quest Software, and they have this tool where it'll go through and read a transaction log, and so you can look for particular tables. It can be just a giant pain in the rear in terms of performance because it takes a really long time to read the transaction log. But if you wanted bulletproof accuracy, that in the past, that was the way you would do it. Like if the action has already taken. If it's actions that you're prepared to modify in the future or prepare to watch for in the future, like if you're like, hey, I want to know who's touching this one table, that's where things like extended events, auditing, and triggers can come in really handy. But those involve changes to the tables. George, no, I'm not going to cover that, but if you go to if you Google for it and search for Hugo Cornelis, Hugo, or just Hugo, SQL Server Hugo lazy spools, there's documents out there on that. Next up, Avi Get Going says, hi Brent, are there code analysis tools that are useful to SQL and what's the best one to use? So you mean like static code analysis that's going to go read through your code base and figure out what the problems are? I haven't seen a good one. There was one called SQL Cop, and I'm trying to remember what the other one was, but they would just flag things that were absolutely harmless in terms of performance, and then they would miss things that were a really, really big deal. So I haven't seen one that I've been impressed with. Hoodlum says, do you have any recommendations for learning SQL, especially for someone who will be working alongside data and tech, but not so much with programming? I'm going to say something, and you're going to think I'm joking. I would go get SQL for Dummies. You're going to think I'm joking, but it was actually good. Last time I picked it up was like 10, 15 years ago. I had a friend of mine who wanted to learn how to write his own reports. And I got the book just to see if it was still any good. Because I remember having it like 20, 25 years ago, and it's surprisingly good. SQL for Dummies, because it's also cross-platform. It works for MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, SQL Server. Just a good, easy way to go and get started. So fantastic there. G Surgeon says, is there an architectural problem with having almost all business logic embedded in stored procedures other than switching? Architecturally, no. Architecturally, no, I don't have a problem with it. Where I get nervous is when you say business logic, because I've even seen people extend that to writing HTML. Where like inside a stored procedure, they'll go build HTML to paint a screen. And I'm like, I get kind of nervous with the expense of that. Given how expensive SQL Server is, I get a little bit nervous about that too. So because it's SQL Server, $2,000 a core, $7,000 a core for Enterprise Edition, kind of sketchy. So architecturally, that's the problem. As a developer though, I'll tell you one other thing that kind of sucks. Change control. So versioning with stored procedures is a whole lot harder than versioning code. It's not impossible. It's just that if you're doing development and stuff like Visual Studio or whatever your favorite IDE is, it's usually easier to version your business logic by doing it inside the application instead. Let's see here. Cranky older gentleman says, does anyone still care about Microsoft certs? Hiring managers. So hiring managers and recruiters still care about Microsoft certs. They use it as a barrier to get in the door. They're just like here, if you're going to go in and be eligible for getting a job here, the bare minimum that we need is a current Microsoft certification. And they're just trying to weed you out of the people who don't have any certs or experience whatsoever. So for that, sometimes you may have to go for a cert, even if it's a really crappy cert. And I'll stop there in terms of my cert stuff. Oh, we should give a shout out to this week's sponsor. So this week's sponsor is Quest. Quest has this database days training events. Pinal, Janice, and I were doing these a few months back, and Quest has brought them back too for these this fall. The next one that's coming up is, I want to say Wednesday. It's either Wednesday or Thursday this week, where I'm going to teach you about filtered indexes, indexed views, and indexed computed columns, all for free. You can go see that over at brentozar.com/go/training days. You can go sign up for that. And if you can't make the live webcast, you can also get the recordings. When you go sign up for that, they will go let you watch the recordings for free as well. So next up we have Jan says, I know that splitting a database in many files is a bad practice, especially after 2008, but what about log files? Okay, so let's talk theory for a second. In theory, SQL Server logs your transactions in a row in the log file. It starts at the beginning of the log file, writes, gets all the way towards the end of it. And at the end of the log file, it's going to circle back around to the beginning of the log file. And if there's space available for reuse, it's going to start writing again. So in theory, there's no performance advantage by breaking things out to separate log files because SQL Server will never access multiples of them simultaneously. Having said that, there's some kinds of storage where when you're writing to them sequentially, the storage runs out of bandwidth. The storage isn't able to keep up. And if you're really, really write intensive, think stock exchanges. If you're really write intensive and you're trying to keep up with every single stock trade, you may need to write a whole bunch to one log file, then switch to another log file just so that your log file storage can keep up. If I had to guess, it's like 1% of 1% of 1% of all SQL servers in the world need that kind of throughput. But when you Google for, are there ever situations where multiple log files are required, you're going to come across articles that talk about stuff like that. So I'm just going to pull a number out of my rear end because my rear end is full of numbers. I'm going to say if you're not doing at least 50 to 100,000 inserts per second sustained, like for hours at a time, you probably don't need to screw around with that. Okay, Ahmed says, my company only loves open source databases, even paid versions of them. I like open source databases too, absolutely. I'm a huge fan. We use Postgres for our own company tooling too as well. Next, Bob the Lobster asks, what would you like to see in the next version of number 2s at least? That's pretty good. That's very good. Bob says, what would you like to see in the next version of SQL Server? I'm going to say something weird. I don't have a lot of complaints. I think SQL Server's actually doing a pretty good job. And as crazy as it is, anything that they give me at this point, I kind of feel like is icing on the cake. This is where Microsoft's really going to get pissed off at me. I could probably use SQL Server 2016 for the rest of my life and be pretty happy. It's damn good. I mean, it's reliable. It has a lot of features. T-SQL is wonderfully robust. I love Kubernetes. I really like SQL Server 2016, 2017. And I don't want to sound like I don't like 2019. When 2019 came out, I was like, this is great. They invested even more stuff in the query processor. I feel like a kid in a candy store. It's pretty freaking awesome. Now, if you told me, like Brent, you can have them work on anything that you want, as crazy as this sounds, I would like better diagnostics. I would like an easier time of troubleshooting problems that we commonly run into. And I'm going to give you, cranky old gentleman says no new features. I'm going to give you something that kind of frustrates me that we even have to have the discussion on in the year 2020. In the year 2020, no one should be running out of disk space in production. It shouldn't happen. We should be able to tell people in advance when they're going to run out of drive space. When you install SQL Server, part of the install wizard should have an email address. Put in a distribution list here for your sysadmins so that we can tell you when stuff's about to break. They don't seem to be going that way at all, though. They don't seem to be investing in easier troubleshooting at all, so I'm kind of like, okay. But I don't have a whole lot of requests. That would be the easiest, the biggest one that I have there. Let's see here. Jojo says, are incrementing integer IDs enough? I like more for that in life. I mean, I like tequila and sandwiches and pizza and long walks on the beach. It's not really enough for me. I guess you have pretty low standards. But is using something as GUIDs better or totally useless? The point where GUIDs are better is if you need to generate unique IDs on the client side, GUIDs can make that easier for you, like that the application can generate its own GUIDs for parent-child rows and then go insert those later. The GUIDs are just too damn high. But that's the classic situation. The other situation is when you have multi-master replication. If I have one SQL Server in North America and another SQL Server in Europe, and I need to let clients insert data into both of those, I can't have an integer ID. Sure, if I have one that starts at 1 and goes up and the other starts at -1 and goes down, that'll work until you add the second or the third set of SQL servers and the fourth set of SQL servers. So things like peer-to-peer replication, replication with data centers around the world, that's where GUIDs start to make more sense. Jackie's rebellious. Next up, no content says, we had an issue with converting a varchar to an int in an inner join. The where condition we've is an inner join being checked first. Yeah, so order of operation has nothing to do with how you write your query. SQL Server can rewrite what happens behind the scenes to choose what needs to be done first. And I actually talk about that in my Fundamentals of Index Tuning class. In Fundamentals of Index Tuning, I talk to you about how to write an index for the where clause, the group by, having, order by, joins, all of that, and which ones are going to be processed in which order. So you can choose which ones you want to index for, and as you choose which you index for, it'll actually change what SQL Server does first in the plan. So you can rewrite how SQL Server processes the query just by adding indexes. Next up, not the DBA you're looking for, says, what is the basic difference between change data capture and change tracking? So the basic difference is that people who can read the manual should use one of those features. People who can't read the manual shouldn't use one of those features. Right? Isn't that terrible? Experior says, it's I like not the DBA you're looking for. It's cool that you start streams early because of that view. Yeah, woo! Kudos from Europe. Did you intend to wake up on, or did I use to wake up on weekends before you streamed? Yeah, I have Christopher Walken, Walker. I usually wake up around 2 or 3 in the morning, and I'm usually at work by around 4. So I actually stream because I'm awake anyway. Like on weekends, this is just the most convenient time for me to stream. I would stream earlier. The only reason I push it till 6 is every now and then I'll sleep until 4, and I like having half an hour to shower and then go eat breakfast, catch up on what's going on just with things that I need to do, the blog, e-commerce, whatever. So then by then I'm usually ready to go be on camera. But yeah, I'm totally a morning person. And then on the flip side, I'm usually in a nap by noon to 1 p.m. Like noon to 1 p.m., I'll take a 1 to 2 hour nap and then back up. And it's almost like I get a second day, and the second day is just for goofing off. Like in the afternoon, I don't do any work. So. Now, let's see. And Richie says, Brent wakes up when I go to sleep. And it's true. It's absolutely true, which is one of the nice things about, remote work. It doesn't really matter when we do what we do. We just get to do it whenever it works for us. Zaki says, hey, Brent, should I store files in databases or use an external service? I'm working on a relatively small app, and I don't think writing an entire file management system is a good idea. So there are things called file systems. They're included with your operating system. You can store files on it. Yeah, and they're free. Now, being a little sarcastic, now let's come back over to reality. If you had to get backups of the files and you wanted those backups to be portable to include the files, if you were talking about something that was like 10 gigs, 15 gigs, sure, you can put files inside the database. But if you think it's going to store more than 10, 15 gigs, put the files on the file system where they belong. That's why the database is called a Relational Database Management System, RDBMS. File systems are called file systems for a reason. Let's see here. Neil says, Which monitoring tool do you think gives more in-depth details on what went wrong with SQL Server? Oh, that's such a good question. People are always like, which monitoring tool should you use? So I don't test monitoring tools on a daily basis because I can't rely on clients having a particular one. I do know some consultants who actually do that as part of their consulting. They'll say, before I work with you, I want you to install this free 14-day trial of whichever tool that it is, like Quest Spotlight, for example, because they all have Richie True, because they all have free 14-day trials. So the consultant will say, 10 days before we work together, go install this application. Then that way, when we work together, I can use the monitoring tool that I know and love. I kind of like that answer, that if you're going to get married to one particular tool vendor, that works out well. It can also backfire when the monitoring tool sucks, because every now and then, every brand out there puts out a bad version and they have to kind of recover from it. I don't think any of them are really better or worse than others. I think that there are a couple that stink really bad that clients often, for a while, I would even name the tool. There's one that's infamous every time that a sales request comes into me, every time I'm talking to a client, and every time that the client says, we have a monitoring tool and we still can't figure out what the problem is, it's always the same tool. It's always the same one tool. There's just one tool that's just absolutely terrible. But the rest of them, they're all kind of interchangeable. Like I could live with any of them. What I would do is I would go and get trials, because they all offer free trials. I would go and get free trials of several of them and pick whichever one you seem to like the interface on best. Next up, Ian says over on YouTube, is there a way to see what queries are granted too much memory, ones that only use a small amount? Yes, I'll show it to you. So we're going to go over to SQL Server Management Studio, which I have not started yet today, and that kind of says something funny about how this Q&A has gone, that I haven't needed to bust open Management Studio. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a query that gets a really large memory grant, and then I'm going to show you how to use SP Blitz Cache to go sort queries by memory grants. So let's go connect into this guy and run a new query. And I'm going to say select top 101 star from. Let's go into Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow. DBO users, order by reputation, descending. And let's make sure that that actually doesn't have an index on it. So this query is going to get a big ginormous memory grant because I don't have an index on reputation, if I remember right. So whenever it finishes, it's going to take a little while, especially since it's the first query that I went through and ran. Good. So now whenever this query finishes, I can go say SP Blitz Cache sort order equals memory grant. What this does is it sorts your plan cache to find the top 10 queries ordered by the size of their memory grant. So if I come in over here, this will show me how much of a grant these got and how much they used. We don't have a sort order on the difference between those two. What you're asking for is to find ones that have large grants but don't actually use it. In order to do that, it would talk about some pretty ugly, it would involve some pretty ugly calculations on our side. So we just do this, and then it's usually pretty easy to go see, oh, I have queries that are getting a 5 gig memory grant and they're only using, 1.5 gigs. If the ones that you're looking for aren't in the top 10, also add skip analysis equals 1, top equals, say, 50. Anytime you run top, though, you probably want, so top will give you the top 50 queries instead of the top just 10. You probably want to run skip analysis too at the same time. Skip analysis doesn't do these warnings analyses. This is what takes so long in order to run SP Blitz Cache, because we run all kinds of evaluations against the query plans in the cache. SP Blitz Cache, totally free. It's part of our first responder kit. Let's see here. And so now, next one, I'm going to jump out of order because I just saw this question go by and I was like, I know exactly. Not the DBA you're looking for. It says, if Helmet blew up tomorrow, what would you buy next? And it's funny because I have this conversation with my wife on a fairly regular basis, and there's kind of like 2 points to this. Right now in San Diego, we have to pay It's about $200 a month for every parking spot above our first one. We had our first parking spot for free in our building, but the second, third, fourth take like $200 a month for each car. That's the one thing stopping me from buying more cars right now. I would go buy more cars immediately. So I can give you a prioritized list. My wife's El Numero Uno is she has a Porsche 911 Turbo all specced out. It's her desktop wallpaper and has been for like 2 years. We would go buy Erica's Porsche 911 because what she's always wanted, she has her color picked out, all her options picked out, everything. And I had my dream car, so it would be time for her to have her dream car. So that would be the number one. The second one that if she couldn't have hers, what I would buy is a Ferrari 308 or 328. These are 1980s cars. It's the red Ferrari that Magnum drove, Magnum PI. And I think that they're unbelievably beautiful cars. And at around 50 bucks or 50,000 bucks, 50 bucks, wouldn't it be amazing? But at around 50,000 bucks, you can get a decent example. And they're just, I think they're some of the most beautiful cars that have ever driven. They're just utterly ridiculous. Yes, you're absolutely right. Happy wife equals happy life. So let's see here. Next up. Oh, Hanny says, what's the best practice to apply database filler? So fill factor. So I said 360. It's okay, but the 308 and 328 is phenomenal, and that this is as much of a mustache as I can get. So I don't like fill factor. I think applying fill factor is a really bad idea. I always want to explain it with a piece of paper in my hand, but I'm going to use my iPad just to represent the size of a piece of paper. If I said leave 20% of every page empty, that page is the same page that's in RAM and on disk. So what I really just said was, I'd like to make my memory 20% smaller. I'd like to make my database file 20% larger. I'd like my table scans to take 20% longer, my index rebuilds 20% longer, backups 20% longer, restores. Can you make those 20% longer, please? My update statistics jobs, tack 20% onto those. CheckDB, take 20% onto those. My storage costs, go ahead and jack those up by another 20%. It's funny how I see consultants recommend that you set fill factor, and they're driving your costs up and making your memory smaller. The very things that they're going to get paid to fix. Me, I don't want you spending money on consulting. I don't want you spending money on databases. I'm good. I drive a Porsche 911. I'm fine. I'm looking at houses in Mexico. So I don't know that I would really set fill factor. I would leave that at 100% where it belongs. All right, going on to the next. Sumit asks, what's your thought about partition indexes? Or is it a conspiracy? What is your thought about partition indexes? Do they perform better? Generally, no. Generally, partition indexes are a wonderful feature for loading and deleting data. They're a crappy feature for select query performance. The only reason that they make select queries faster, the idea is that if you put in the partitioning clause or the partitioning column in your where clause, SQL Server will be able to just scan the partition that has your data. Just put an index on it. If you put an index on whatever you're searching for, that reduces the search scope. You don't need to partition. That's just what a regular index is. Oh, he's a genius. Sekar says, Brent, is it good to have an index on a frequently updated column, like a status field? It depends on whether you query it. If you need it, if you like it, put an index on it. If you need to query it very frequently, then it can be good to have, but if it only just ever changes and you don't query on it, then it can be bad to have. The thing is, usually you don't only want status. You want other things inside the index too. If you only query by status and nothing else, it would bring back millions of rows, right? Because you have millions of rows in the table with the same status. Now, just I don't know. A, I don't know if you're referring to me, and B, I'm curious what your high school music teacher sounded like. Haresh, yes, absolutely. SSMS, the code quality's gotten a lot better with recent versions, but also just make sure that you don't have any third-party add-ons installed. The more third-party add-ons you have, the worse that seems to get. CW Train, good to see you. So on YouTube, CW Train said, CDC says, what did it change to? CT says, did it change? Primary key watch only. That's a great way of summing it up. I really like that a lot. Next up, Moss says, do you know or could you recommend any experts in MySQL? I don't personally. The company that's kind of big in this field is Percona, Percona. Percona kind of has the big name around MySQL tuning, and I only say that just because I know what their name is, but that's probably the place that I would start. Amit says, we said that, so I'm going to go clear that guy. Next up, we'll go see. Zaki says, I've seen one of my friends working on a complex compression system for SQL data. I told him to just get more disk space, but he rejects it. What's your take on this? Okay, so a 1 terabyte drive is about $400. So what your friend is saying is that he values his time less than $100. And maybe it's true. Maybe your friend totally sucks at development. Maybe they make minimum wage. I mean, it could be absolutely possible that they've been working for months on a compression system, but it's kind of sad. Now, I'm going to stop there. That's just totally true. Apfelklonk says, is there a way to reuse code without sacrificing sargability, like for reporting queries with different group bys for weekday, week hour? So there are a few answers in there. One way that's kind of popular is computed columns. So with computed columns, you can save some stuff ahead of time and even index on them. And I will teach you about that this week during a totally free webcast from Quest. Quest is paying for my time so that y'all can just learn over at Quest Database Training Days. So you can go register for that over at brentozar.com/go/training days, where I'm going to teach you how to do index computed columns, indexed views, and filtered indexes. These are 3 advanced tricks that you can use with indexing to pre-bake data for reporting ahead of time. It's a perfect answer for your question. It gives me a chance to give a shout out to Quest. Thank you, Quest, for sponsoring this week's webcast. Woo! All right. Next up, DB Augie says, I'm trying to transition from Oracle DBA to SQL Server. Oh, that's interesting. Oracle, any resources for exploiting the error log to troubleshoot problems? SQL Server's error log blows. I wouldn't recommend that as a place to start for troubleshooting performance problems. I would recommend it for places to start with troubleshooting errors, but it's just literally an error log, and it doesn't really have an intuitive way to rip through it quickly. Most SQL Server DBAs just don't start there. It's a great question, though. I can understand why, coming from Oracle, that would seem like, why doesn't anybody look at the error log? We just don't go there. SQL Santa says, rhetorical, when was the last time Microsoft added features to peer-to-peer replication? I would almost say they're on a mission these days where they don't add features to anything. They build brand new features. Kubernetes, R, Python, Java, machine learning, like that they're on this aggressive mission to go add new stuff, but they don't ever go back and fix existing stuff. I will say they've done that. They've done some fixing existing stuff with Column Store. Column Store, they've done a pretty good job on going back and continuing to invest in it, but everything else, oh my God, it's been a hot mess. Christopher Walken says, I'm going to call you Christopher Walken, what about an Oracle RAC equivalent for better HA for SQL Server? So the thing is, with Oracle RAC, you're supposed to be able to write to either SQL or either Oracle Server at the same time. Microsoft has talked to people are like, okay, so do you actually do that? Do you actually write to 2 Oracle boxes at the same time? Can you show us why you do that and how that works? And people are like, oh, we don't actually pay for it. We just want it in a cheaper SQL server. Okay, yeah, no. If you truly need the ability to write to two separate Oracle boxes, you should probably go and spend the money on Oracle Rack and let us know how that works out for you while you're begging for change outside of the shopping mall. And by the way, not a lot of people are going to the shopping mall anymore. It's going to take you a really long time to pay off those Oracle licenses these days. But for the rest of us, it's just not that important. How to hack Wi-Fi. Okay, yeah, there we go. Next up. Ali says, how do you create an OLAP database? What I assume you mean, I'm going to go drop my air conditioning temperature. I assume that you mean analysis services. So with analysis services, that's a totally separate product. It just happens to share the same name as SQL Server. It's not like it actually shares the same way that we manage it, the same binaries or anything like that. So if you truly mean analysis services, it's a totally separate tool. Go get a separate, books on how to use that. But if you're talking about just how to create a database in SQL Server, just type create database and whatever. There's no difference between a regular database and an OLAP database. I'm going to go mute anything channel just because they're with the how to hack Wi-Fi. Let's see here. Oh, and I logged out of Restream. Hold on a second here. Let me go fix that by logging into Restream real quick. While I do that, we'll give a shout out to this week's sponsor just so that they can go do that while I go figure out my Restream. Restream.io, go log in, and go get my chat back. I should play music or something while I do that. Log in, just so that I go get that, and then where's my chat? Where is my chat? Chat app. There we go. Open a browser, and there that goes. And there we go. All right, cool. Move that over here and move you over here. There we go. So now, let's see, who just asked that? DB Augie says, is that fog outside your window or smoke from the bonfire of the vanities? It's probably both. We have really bad air quality today out in San Diego. I think it's like 150 parts per million or whatever the number is. Anything channel again. All right, let me make sure that I block that user. There we go. MBO says, is it a good idea to rebuild indexes in a log shipping environment? And he puts in parentheses forwarded records. Do you kind of two parts to the question. Do you need to fix forwarded records? Yes. Is the right fix regularly rebuilding them in a log shipped environment? No. The right fix would be to put a clustered index on the table so that you don't have to deal with that every day. But it's good on you for knowing that you're fixing forwarded records. That's absolutely fantastic. Amit says, as a database administrator, how do I convince my developer teams about software architects and they say X is better than Y database, but I know there is only architecture issue. Pick your battles. So pick your battles. What is it that you really want to win? Let's say that you're able to browbeat them into believing that you think your database is better. All you're really going to convince them to do is to get you out of the company as quickly as possible because you're standing in between them and shipping features. It's not on you to convince them that your database is better. You want to go learn. What is it that you like better about that other database? And don't freaking respond. Don't answer. Don't say one word. Take notes. And then go learn about that other database. So for example, when MongoDB started catching fire, when everybody was like, oh, MongoDB, it's amazing. I'm like, oh, what do you like about MongoDB? And they're like, well, we don't have to define our tables in advance. We can just put any unstructured data in that we want to. And then I'm like, okay, great. Let me go take a note on that and see what else. And then you go research to see what you learn about. It's full of pinto beans. It smells like it too as well. But you go learn it. Use that as an advantage to go learn. Because if you're truly an architect like you say you are, then you need to hear what their complaints are about your database and then go learn about the other database and see why they're better. And it may they could be completely wrong, but you want to be open at least to thinking that maybe they're right. Their music video. Let's see. Bala says, would you recommend how to do automation in SQL Server rather than using third-party tools? So that's a tricky thing. When you say how to do automation in SQL Server, it's a really big world. There are so many things that you could possibly automate. The place that I would start is with DBA tools. So DBA tools, if you go to dbatools.io, this is a PowerShell framework that's all about automating all kinds of things. So this is probably the place that I would go start. You don't need any third-party tools for this. It's just plain old PowerShell, so I would go ahead and start there. All right, let's go block Rohit so that he doesn't show up again. Off he goes. Next up, let's see here. Mossy Moss says, could you explain how constant care works? So what I saw so far, I love it. The recommendations are great. Oh, great question. The way the constant care works is every day you have an app that runs just once a day and pulls your SQL Server for all kinds of diagnostic data. Index usage stats, wait stats, sys configurations, all kinds of different things. Explains how, or pulls in all kinds of stuff. Sends it to us up in the cloud. We import it into Aurora, Amazon Aurora Postgres, which we basically keep the same table structures as the DMVs. So like we can query sys databases. It's just that we have it for like 3,000-4,000 SQL servers. So we query sys databases and we give you recommendations based on what's happening now and what's happened over the last 30 days. We keep up to 30 days of history about your SQL Server. So we can give you trending, for example. One of my favorite things with that is, hey, your SQL Server is bored. There's nothing happening on this SQL Server. Performance is fine, so you can leave it alone. You don't have to worry about performance on that SQL Server. Go focus on other things instead. Or one database has been grew like weeds, like 10% in the last 24 hours. You know, go take a look and see what's going on inside that database to go find what's going on. It's kind of fun as a database administrator to have the diagnostic data for thousands of SQL servers all around the world and be able to spot trends and things like that. I love that kind of stuff. Amit says, how do we handle large index maintenance with a huge transactional environment? Reorganize takes too long, rebuild needs a disk space. Search for my name, Brent Ozar, and index defragmentation. And I've got a whole hour-long video just on that topic. So search for Brent Ozar index defragmentation, and I got a video just on that one. You can go watch that over on YouTube for free too. Drop Table Employee says, what's your over or under on when Microsoft will add a functional dark theme to Management Studio? So let's think about this for a second. Would it change what database you used? Would you change over to Oracle or Postgres because you didn't have a dark theme to Management Studio? Imagine going to your boss and saying, boss, here's the deal. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and we need to change our entire application. We need to use a different database platform. And you know why? Because we don't have a dark theme in Management Studio. You would have a butthole the size of a pizza from your boss shoving his foot so far up your rear end, your breath would smell like Nikes. That's how bad you would get your butt kicked for trying to pull that stunt. So do I think that Microsoft should waste $1 of their time working on a dark theme for Management Studio? Are you out of your mind? No, not no, but hell no. Get your big Nike smelling rear end out of my office. That is utterly ridiculous. So that's why I don't think that they're going to do it anytime soon. And it almost kind of makes me nervous because if they do it, that tells me that they're working on the wrong stuff. Like there are things in Management Studio where it crashes and you lose files. So don't do that. Contact Administrator says, is there any way to determine data uniqueness from statistics? I would probably ask, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Like, what's the problem you're trying to solve there? And because I don't think that you're going down the right track. We'll do a few fast rounds. What about test-driven development and SQL? What about it? All right. Surly Dove says, Check out T-SQL-T, which if you want to really hurt for a while, it works. It's just really a giant pain in the rear. Another fast one, Junior DBA says, is create index with drop existing on safe to use in production to move tables from a primary file group to secondary file group? Is it safe to use? Yes. Will it completely accomplish that goal? Not necessarily. If you have includes that are off row, it may not work. It's totally safe to use. It just may not completely accomplish your goal. Next up, Zaki says, how does training a machine learning model on a database work? Damned if I know, but it is a real thing. It is absolutely a real thing, but SQL Server has machine learning built into it. I just saw the first consulting help request for that in like 3 years come through on my email. Cannot run distinct on the data. Why not? What's the problem you're trying to solve, though? What's the problem where you go, you need to know uniqueness? That's what you need to know. Don't tell me I can't put the shopping cart inside the pizza box. Tell me what's the problem you're trying to solve. Why do you want to put a shopping cart inside a pizza box? What's the business problem you're trying to solve? Next up, what are some of the use cases for using CLR in SQL Server? If you want to drive your CPU higher, if you want to make sure that you get called back for consulting when they can't figure out where the memory leak is coming from, or if you only know how to use C# and you don't know how to use T-SQL, then those are, of course, I'm being facetious. One good use case for it is regex. If you need to implement regular expressions, that's not something that's built into T-SQL. You could do that in CLR if you wanted to. Thank you, Surly Dev. Another round of applause there for Surly Dev. I'm working tirelessly through all of y'all's questions because y'all love to ask all kinds of questions, and he is keeping me sane partially through the course of this Q&A. Oh, SQL Santa says, could you think of any reason to enable trace flag 2861 except if required by a monitoring tool? No, and Microsoft has already said that in the last couple of versions at least, 2861 doesn't even do anything. It's just a monitoring tool. I know exactly what monitoring tool it is. El Crapo, not so good. Next up. Cadabradera Pumper says, what is a good starting point to think about in-memory database design? Can you use Redis for caching or only SQL Server? Generally, you want to use the cheapest thing you possibly can, and SQL Server is not usually the cheapest thing. If you're purely doing caching, go use Redis. It's way cheaper. It scales out nicely between multiple boxes. They even have persistence to disk now if you want to do that kind of thing. So if you're a developer and you're thinking about caching, you should totally think about Redis or Elasticache, whatever managed Redis you want to go use. Amit says, can we use SQL Server for key value or JSON? You can if you want to light dollar bills on fire, but it's $2,000 a CPU core for standard edition, $7,000 a core for enterprise edition. So it doesn't really make sense to spend that much money for key value storage or JSON when you can go get key value databases for free. So that's my thought on that one. I always try to keep people's use as little money as possible in order to solve their problems. It says, what do you think about graph tables? Have you experienced it on SQL Server? No, because same thing again there. There have been graph databases out for a really long time that are way cheaper than SQL Server. It seems like SQL Server just kind of checked a box with this one. So if you only need graph, if you have all kinds of other stuff in your database and you just have a small usage for graph, then sure, it would make sense to use it. But if you're starting a brand new graph project in the year 2020, it doesn't really make sense to use SQL Server as your primary data storage. Oh, TK says, after I learned SQL Server, first off, a round of applause for being done. It's fantastic that you're done learning. That's amazing. I would love to be like you someday because I'm still learning SQL Server. Man, there's a lot in it. But what should I learn next? NoSQL or the cloud? Go to the business, go to the person who pays your raise, the person who's going to give you a raise at the end of the year. Go in there and say, okay, what is it that you want to be able to do that you can't do today? Like, what's the business problem that you need to be able to solve that you can't do today? And then based on that, go learn the thing that'll help them accomplish that. I'm going to hit Zacky's because it's interesting. So I've seen a lot of Android devs using Firebase instead of SQL. Is there a reason for that? Yes. If you don't want to deal with the management of a database, and if your clients are going to connect directly, there's no app server in the middle, your clients, like your JavaScript, whatever, are going to go connect directly to the database on the back end. Firebase is really nice for that. I just happen to be looking at Firebase recently because it's kind of cool. I don't develop on it or anything like that. I just, read the marketing material. That's kind of the end of that one. Amit says, how can we adopt the MS SQL? Oh, you want a baby? Oh, I want a baby too. I don't really want a baby. Babies smell bad. They poop a lot. For multi-data center environments, do we need multi-master model or what? What you want to ask is, do you really need to write to databases in two places? If you really do, it's banana pants expensive. It's crazy expensive. Often when people say multi-data center environments, what they really mean is they want one active and then another one passive. If you truly want two active data centers, I probably wouldn't actually start with SQL Server. I would start with something that's more designed to be sharded out sideways, just built in. George says, what espresso machine do you use and which coffee is your favorite? I should be ashamed to say this, but I use a Nespresso. I know, I use a Nespresso. I use an espresso because it's really easy. It'll make espresso in like 60 seconds and I don't have to futz with anything. It's a little bit more expensive and it's not a great quality of coffee, but it's pretty doggone good for something that I can make in 60 seconds and not worry about it, that I can just go walk up to it, push a button, and boom, I got espresso in 60 seconds. When I make coffee for my own pleasure, like that I'm going to sit there and really enjoy it. Exactly, yes. I have so many jokes about that. Yeah, I like him. He's really cool. But when I go make coffee for my own enjoyment, I don't actually make coffee. I go downstairs, and there's a coffee shop downstairs that does pour-overs, and I tend to just get whatever. I'm like, okay, what's new in terms of beans? What can I go try that's new and different? So it's true. It's true. I have 4 coffee makers altogether, but the only one we even have out in the counter anymore is the Nespresso. I have a Technivorm Mocha Master, a French press, an AeroPress. I'm trying to remember the other one. But they're all in my closet because we just don't even use them anymore. It's kind of bizarre. Zachy says, I thought the grayness was outside of the view was because your window is tinted. No, San Diego really looks like this right now, and it's that smoke and fog. Normally, you can see from over to the right, I can see Mexico. It's also raining. I can see drops of rain on the window, so it's like misting. So. Next up, Alex DBA says, should I use temporal tables for auditing? If the auditing has to be legally defensible, like if you're going to face an attorney in court, then temporal tables are a bad idea because people can delete data out of temporal tables. So if someone wants to hide their tracks, they just delete the rows in the temporal tables or change them. Like they can pin the blame on somebody else by editing the temporal tables. So if it has to be legally defensible, no. If you're just doing it for your own curiosity purposes, they're interesting. But Neutron Star. How is SQL Server different from Oracle? What you would probably expect me to say is you would probably expect me to say that SQL Server is better. And I'm actually going to say it's not. I'm actually going to say that every time I look at any kind of piece of documentation about Oracle, it's freaking amazing. It's so many capabilities. I'm just amazed by how good that thing is. It's pretty impressive. But the problem is it costs like several times more than SQL Server does. And people tend to run it on Oracle rather than on Windows, and it also doesn't have really deep integration on Visual Studio. And because the Microsoft stack, if you buy into the Microsoft stack, you're typically running Windows, developing in Visual Studio, deploying on Windows, and you're hosting your data in SQL Server, and then in Azure too as well. People tend to fall into either the Microsoft stack or the Java stack if they're going to go on the Java side. Fix our little white balance here. Next up, let's see here. Oh, we got all kinds of questions. We have so many that I can kind of start picking and choosing now. Let's see. Next up, Zachy says, is using Windows normal as a DBA? A lot of people I've seen who deal with servers use some distribution of Linux. For SQL Server DBAs tend to use the Microsoft stack. Granted, there's the new trend of running SQL Server under Linux. It's much more the exception than the rule, though. Like less than 1% of 1% of SQL servers out there are running under Linux, unless you count if Microsoft is running Linux under the hood for Azure SQL DB, which they totally could be. But in the SQL Server world, you tend to see most SQL Server DBAs running Windows, at least in the places where they manage SQL Server. I run a Mac, and I have since Windows Vista came out. Like back when Windows Vista came out, I was like, oh my God, that's absolutely terrible. And but it was still, when I go to manage SQL Server, I'm usually in Windows. Let's see here. I'm going to delete a couple. Flippin says, we have a large number of large heap tables. Remember, never, ever, 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 ever use the word large. Use sizes, because databases always seem large to you, but they're not necessarily that large. Rows don't get updated if often, if ever. No forwarded fetches. They're non-clustered indexes with solid state drives. The drives don't matter. It doesn't have anything to do with the drives. Do you still recommend that these tables should still have a clustered index? That's a great question. I want a clustered index when rows are getting updated or deleted. But if your rows aren't getting updated or deleted and you do have indexes, I'm okay with a heap. It's not that bad. Horka says, is it a good idea to set cost threshold to 50 in case of new installations, or should it only be touched if there are problems that point to that direction? Yes. And if you go get my setup checklist, if you go to brentozar.com and click scripts up at the top, I have a setup checklist that walks you through that and gives you links as to why. A lot of us are actually pushing Microsoft to change that default too as well. It's a really terrible default. Over on YouTube, Meravat says, can you recommend a YouTube channel to learn SQL? So I haven't looked for that because, of course, I learned SQL. You see these gray hairs? These aren't just from answering YouTube questions. They're also because I'm old. I'm in my mid to late 40s now. And so I learned SQL a long time ago, back before there was YouTube. I know, seriously, there was actually a time before YouTube. No kidding. I know it sounds hard to believe. But because of that, I just don't have a good recommendation. I would look at what other people are saying in here because they may have recommendations for it. But it's a great, valid question. I just don't have an answer for it. Zaki said, are you on the latest Database Management Studio? Yes, I use SQL Server Management Studio 18. Jesus says, apart from SQL Server DBA, what's on demand right now in terms of the number of jobs in the current market? You want to be really careful looking at that, because when something is trendy, like artificial intelligence or machine learning, let me give you a peek into what happens with executives. Listen, get everybody in here from tech. I was on an airplane this weekend and I read this magazine about artificial intelligence. We need to get us some of that artificial intelligence. So I want you to go hire a couple of people right now to go learn artificial intelligence and put that into place right here. That's exactly what happens all over the world. Continuously, executives read things in a magazine, or they hear something from their friend at the golf club, or whatever it is that those people do. And so you'll see this all of a sudden, whoosh, huge rush in hiring for this one technology. And then whoosh, it'll all disappear as people figure out that, oh, that's not really going to save our business. So I would just be careful on looking at volume of data. Volume, especially around, it's true, people have seen this a lot. So I would just be careful with judging by which jobs are in demand. Let's see here. Oh, we actually answered that one already, so I'll go ahead and clear that one. SQL Eagle. That's kind of a cool name. I like that, SQL Eagle. It says clustered column store index tables user can be painfully slow. Any solution? Non-clustered indexes. So you can put non-clustered row store indexes on top of column store tables. So from there, because I'm assuming when you say to select top 1000 star, there's probably a where clause. You can add non-clustered indexes on top of clustered column store, since I can't remember if it was SQL Server 2017 or 16 where they brought that out. I can't quite remember. But that's a great use case where non-clustered still makes sense. Non-clustered row store makes sense on top of clustered column store. Also, filtered indexes, too, can make a difference with that as well. You can't filter for top 1,000 unless the thing is deterministic, but you get where I'm going with that. Jensen says, how can we reduce TempDB size? Shrinking isn't helping. Free your plan cache. Free the plan cache, and then that's the thing that's usually stopping it from shrinking. People may also be using it, but I'm going to gamble that you know nobody's using it right now. So try freeing the plan cache. That usually does it. Jojo says, now that more people are using .NET Core, I think CLR will be even less used. Is it possible for CLR to be even less used? I'm not sure if it actually is. Thangaraj says, hi, I worked on SQL Server for 4 years and I changed my job and I'm now working on MySQL. Which one is good? The one that you're getting paid for. Woo-hoo! The one that you're getting paid for is fantastic. That's the one that's my favorite. The one that you're not getting paid for, that one sucks. So there's my answer there. Now, in a more serious basis, which one's better or depends on what your business needs are. MySQL's free. SQL Server is not very free. There is Express Edition, which is free, and Express Edition is very similar to small MySQL installations. For example, we were on brenozar.com on MySQL. It's on WordPress, has a MySQL backend, and I would never dream of moving that over to SQL Server, but if I wanted to, I could. Similar performance and power. It would be a giant pain in the rear, though. Richard J asks a great question. Would I recommend SQL Server patching be automated? I wish I could, but the problem is if you automate patching, you got to make sure that nothing critical is happening on the SQL Server at the time you push the patch out. Because rollbacks in SQL Server are single-threaded. What happens if you got like a big data warehouse job loading all kinds of stuff into SQL Server? It's been using like 12, 16 cores for an hour, and then you go throw in a patch and it causes a rollback to happen. Your SQL Server could be unusable for hours or days. So I get really nervous about people pushing out patches without doing some kind of activity check to make sure that there are no open transactions, there's no activity running, things like that. Next up, what data type would be a good choice to store XML data? XML. Next up, Giorgio says, what join should I use that is the fastest? I have a real hard time joining more than one table. The query becomes very slow. It's less about the join type that you're using, and it's more about how you write the query, what its execution plan looks like. I have a class called Fundamentals of Query Tuning that helps you elaborate that exact thing. But I've got plenty of examples with joins with 20, 30, 40 tables, and it performs fine. Also joins or queries that don't join any tables, and they perform like a Ford Pinto from 1978. It's less about the number of joins. It's more about how you write your queries and how you index those tables. Let's see here. Next up, Thangarang says, can you please explain parameter sniffing? Yes, and it's in my one-day Fundamentals of Parameter Sniffing class. So if you search for Brentozar parameter sniffing, there's actually YouTube videos out there that are totally free where I spend like an hour explaining the basics of parameter sniffing. Go start there because it's free. And then when you want to learn deeper than that, go to my parameter sniffing classes. Keith says, I have a friend, I like that uses simple mode in production with hourly backups. How do I implement full safely? If they're doing simple mode in production and they're doing full backups, my guess, and they're saying hourly backups, my guess is that every night they're doing a full backup and then every hour they're doing differential backups, which only change the 8K pages that were, or only back up the 8K pages that were changed in the last hour. That might actually be okay for the business, but if it's not okay and if they want point-in-time recovery, It's a really good question what you're asking. When you flip it into full recovery model, you have to do log backups pretty frequently to make sure that you keep space available in the transaction log. I have a class for that called Fundamentals of Database Administration. And I know it sounds like I'm pitching classes right here, right and left, but you're asking questions they're great questions, but it's way far beyond what I can explain in 30 seconds. So that's where Fundamentals of Database Administration comes in. Neil asks over on YouTube, what does Brent do to keep updated with new tech and changes in SQL? I read a lot of blogs, and you can read the same ones that I read. I'll show you how. So if you search for Brent Ozar GitHub, I have a repo. This is just my personal one. This isn't the company one. So if you search for Brent Ozar GitHub, I have a repo with a list of the file or list of the RSS feeds that I subscribe to, SQL blogs. And so here you can go in and get the full OPML file, which has all the blogs that I subscribe to. So you can go add those to your feed reader. So we're talking 234 lines of code. It's probably 200 blogs out of there. So you can go grab that if you like. It's also available as a Feedly collection for those of you who read your RSS feeds via Feedly. I do. It's wonderful. Can't say enough good things about them as a feed reader. So you can also click on that if you use Feedly, and you can subscribe to the same blogs that I do. And I keep it pretty up to date. Like I updated it 2 months ago. I'm sure I've added a couple of subscriptions since then, but that's how I kind of get started. Next up, let's see here. Next up, Remedies. No. Every way sucks so badly, just so terribly badly. It is a giant, massive pain. I have totally dealt with that. I work for a company that had to do it for 3,000 SQL servers in the United States alone, and it was a giant pain in the rear. We built our own replication format with our own web service and API calls just to keep the data in sync because it was such a pain in the rear. Next up, Mr. Keeney says, what is your opinion on Polybase? Do you believe it will get more popular? No, I don't. I don't think it will. So the idea behind Polybase is that you can use SQL Server as a data hub to run queries against all kinds of different servers, against Polybase or against Hadoop, against Oracle, against MySQL, SAP, whatever you want to run queries against. I don't think it's going to become more popular. I think it's relatively kind of expensive, and I don't see people wanting to bet the farm on SQL Server being at the center of their entire data infrastructure, especially in the day and age of the cloud, where people are starting to shift their focus more. If they're going to put something that's the absolute total center of their data environment, it's probably going to be in the cloud more than it is on premises. It's just that if you're going to do that kind of architectures, I don't see that becoming much more popular. Contact says, I want to order an index in the fashion that contains the most distinct. Oh, so you're back to the uniqueness thing. Okay, so you don't actually. That's not the right way that you design indexes. And I teach why inside my class, Fundamentals of Index Tuning, but I'm going to give you the short answer. For example, at Stack Overflow, there's a creation date. In Stack Overflow, every row has a creation date column. That's super distinct. Everything in there, each of the posts, the comments, the users, all has unique creation dates. But do you think that that should go first in your indexes? Probably not. Because even though it's unique, and even when you query by it, you don't query for creation date equals July the 4th of 2007 at 9:17 a.m. That's not how date range queries works. You query for ranges of dates, like show me everyone who was created yesterday. Show me all of the comments that were left in the last 7 days. The uniqueness of the data isn't selectivity. The uniqueness of what's in your where clause, that's what selectivity is. And we go through a lot of those examples over in Fundamentals of Index Tuning so that you can learn how to organize those. But now I see where you were going, and that's why it's the wrong problem to solve there. Next up, SQL Eagle says, oh, we already had that. We answered that one, so let's close that. Noob says, I really am a big noob. Well, if you're a giraffe, you are large in terms of size. Stuck in a situation in my job where I'm supposed to alter a column on its really large. Oh, it's MySQL. I don't work with MySQL, sorry. I'm just as big of a noob as you are at MySQL. The place where I would ask is dba.stackexchange.com. At dba.stackexchange.com, that's where you can go post questions about all kinds of databases. Lots of talented people over there who can answer that question. So, but you're right in that it isn't an easy question. It's definitely the kind of thing that you should post over there because it is a really good question. Jesus says, if someone only wants integration services and not the SQL Server, how much do you pay for that? The same as SQL Server. When Microsoft wants to sell you something expensive, they put it inside the cereal box that is SQL Server. They put it inside the SQL Server licensing box and they say that it's free. It's like a free toy that comes with your breakfast cereal. And then that way, when you decide that you want to buy a bunch of the free toys, Microsoft is like, sure, you're just going to have to buy 6,000 boxes of cereal. So it's not really free. Really, when they throw something in for free, they're about to tell you that it's going to be extremely expensive when you go and buy it. What I would do instead, I mean, the one nice thing is that you can buy as few CPU cores as possible and just installing SSIS on there. But what I would do instead is go look at Azure Data Factory, because Azure Data Factory is really kind of like the next generation of SQL Server integration services. And then instead of paying for SQL Server, you can just pay by the month for, oh, boy, that doesn't work well, does it? I'm probably missing something obvious. Next up on YouTube, Nasi says, what's the ideal approach to monitor SQL traffic or enhance security in terms of auditing? By a third-party appliance that sits in between SQL Server and the rest of the network. Imperva, Guardium are examples of that. If you look for Google for SQL Server auditing appliance, these are pieces of hardware, or you can buy them as VMs that capture all network traffic coming in and out of the SQL Server. The DBA doesn't get permissions to them. The developers don't get permissions to them. So that way you can ensure that it's a sealed box that nobody tampered with. Only the security team gets access to it, and they can then run whatever reports that they want. That's the way that you do it in a legally defensible fashion. Let's see, next up, we'll go down. D. Toby says, I wanted to thank you for these sessions. You're welcome. Thank you. Says, for me, these sessions are unique and a strange experience. You know what? They are for me as well. Next up, Haresh says, I like your reactions and mimicry. You are very good at that. Works really well for things like Twitch streams. It's not very good if I have a manager. That's why you don't see me working for a company anymore. You see me having my own company because that's the only way that I could make a living doing this. If I had to go back and report to someone else again, I would need a very, very tolerant boss. Let's see. Zaki says, I've seen a lot of people going into React, Express, and Node. Would you recommend using SQL? And I assume you mean SQL Server for this. No, generally, if you're using stuff like React and Node.js, the Node.js, the kinds of examples that you're going to find out there aren't going to use SQL Server. You want to find use the tool that there are the most examples for and the most support for, so that when you run into problems, you can quickly find other people who are doing it, and you're not going to find a lot of people or as many people using things like React with a SQL Server backend. Let's see here. WRTKO says, do you have a stylist? Your outfits are great. My wife. Yes, my wife would be my stylist. Not hairstylist. I actually went and got a haircut. This haircut's terrible, but we don't have a whole lot of haircut options right now in San Diego because most things are closed down. So there you go. Rumia does. SQL Server's had a JSON data type for a couple of versions now. Why do I think you don't read the documentation? That's a difficult, more challenging question. Robot Robert, says, I'm a noob, just finished a data analytics boot camp. If you were to hire an intern to help with database cleaning, what SQL database skills would you look for? Oh, that's intriguing. For me, it's less than about like specific SQL or DB skills. It would be more about go tackle a project and show how you did it. Go take an open source data set and clean it to prep it for analysis and write a blog post or explaining what you did in which order. And then that, when people want to see what your skills are, say, here's an example of a project that I did so you can see my thought process. So then that way they would be able to see all the skills that you use start to finish. That to me would be more useful than yelling out a bunch of generic SQL terms. Because with data cleansing, it's just going to be like, I know how to run select and update statements. Richie says, I wouldn't hire an intern to clean data. You say that, but I bet a bunch of data science companies would. Interns are cheap. Next up, Ravi Taja says, hi Brent, what is the cost of replicating a read-only instance? I have no idea what the user is asking. I have a blog post about that. I'll show it to you. So if I say Brent Ozar reporting server cost, if I search for that, there's a post on here, the cost of adding a reporting server. Hit that because it has a whole bunch of costs in there. It's not just about the licensing or the hardware. It's about things like the troubleshooting and performance tuning of it. So go search for Brent Ozar reporting server cost. There we go. And now let's come back over here. Oh, I should give a shout out to our sponsor too. It's been a little while since I've done that. So this week I'm teaching a totally free class on filtered indexes, indexed views, and indexed computed columns. You can go attend that totally for free over at brentozar.com/go/training days. That's Quest Software's database training days, where they're doing a series of webcasts with several of us, like me, Panal, and Janice, are all doing totally free webcasts. And if you can't be there on the day of the webcast, they also email you the link to the recording as well. So you get all that over at brentozar.com/go/training days. Should also give a shout out to the last couple of subscribers and followers that we've had there. Cesar Condor Human and Angry Scott from, I'm guessing, South Africa, or ZA is South Africa, I think. I'm not sure if that's, yeah, I think it's ZAS, I think South Africa. But if you like what you're seeing and you want to get notifications whenever I start streaming, go subscribe or follow me on YouTube, Twitch, or my Facebook page, and you'll get alerts whenever I go and start these streams. This is the last regularly scheduled one that I'm doing. The rest of them will be totally ad hoc, just whenever a window opens up in my schedule. So you'll want to subscribe or follow so that you get notified whenever these start. Next weekend, I won't be doing one. I've got classes that I'm teaching next weekend. So let's come back over here and say, let's see, we still got like 20 minutes left. Let's see, close that. Dashboard J says, how would you tackle bringing data from Oracle tables into SQL Server when the Oracle tables are wider than SQL Server will allow? I have no idea. I don't know. I have no idea. I wish I had a better answer for you. I don't. Ask at Stack Exchange. Go to dba.stackexchange.com and include numbers. Include numbers about how many columns are inside there. Next up, SQL Santa says, I'm using collate in the where clause. SQL Server is on CI being collated to CS. Any way to help this? Yes, you can use persisted computed columns with indexing, and I talk about that on my Quest webcast that I just plugged. So by all means, tune in there, and I'll teach you how to do that exact thing. Sekar says, Brent, can you give your recommendation for AWS EBS volume types to use for data and log storage for a 5 terabyte transactional data in EC2? Oh, dang. When you get over a terabyte worth of transactional data, it starts to performance speed or storage performance starts to become incredibly important, because if you need to do an insert, update, or delete, if that page isn't cached in RAM, you actually have to wait for that page to come back from disk in order to change it. So the clients that I have who are doing multi-terabyte transactional stuff in EC2 tend to be on provisioned IOPS. Provisioned IOPS are not cheap. They are what you call expensive. But if you're going to run a multi-terabyte OLTP database in EC2, that's kind of just how things work. General purpose solid state is not going to be enough for you. You're going to need provisioned IOPS. Next up on YouTube, Jitesh says, should a non-programming person learn SQL first or R or Python? Oh, that's, it would depend on what your career objectives were. If you wanted to do just general systems administration, I would probably send you down the Python path because it's probably going to help you more with general automation through the rest of your life. If you want to be a database person, like if you want to explore data and write reports and see relationships between things, I would say SQL first, because SQL is the language of data. Python is more the language of systems, moving things around, analyzing things, but processing more than it is data itself. It's a language of doing things with data, but it's not really the language of data. Zaki says, is there a way to prevent SQL injections on the database side in addition to escaping your backend SQL queries? The thing with SQL injection is if you try to build something to be safe, you have to be right every single time. The hacker only has to be right once. So I want defense layers everywhere that I can get it. And for me, with SQL injection, that means never using what the user passed in to build the query. Use it as a parameter, never use it as part of the string that you're building for a query. You can't escape it enough. A creative developer or creative hacker will find their way around your defenses. If you want to learn how freaky it is, search for Burt Wagner SQL injection. So Burt Wagner has a series of videos that will blow your mind on how you can do SQL injection. And when you watch each of these and see how much work that's involved with it, you'll realize why you really don't want to be trying to defend yourself against attacks like this. It's just too dangerous. Let's see here. Next up. Do you know any open source graphical visualization tools for visualizing table stats and data skew? No. I would want to know more about the problem that you're trying to solve. Like what's the question you're trying to answer? If you're just trying to see pretty pictures of data, go to Reddit. There's a Reddit subreddit called Beautiful Data, I think it is, and it'll show you all kinds of random graphs. But if you're trying to ask a question about your data, start with the question. Don't start with show me random graphs about my data. It sounds like I'm lecturing. We'll do a speed round of a few. Amit, you can't. Replicas with different indexes than a primary. You can't. No can do. Thanks for putting that in. Absolutely. Those are both fantastic. Their data is beautiful. It's perfect. GMOS DBA says, a friend asks, could you share a general strategy for tuning queries involving nested views? No, I do have entire classes on that. So that's the entire mastering query tuning piece. You go into that. Next up. Zaki says, I've seen lots of libraries that can generate SQL queries. Why are developers still writing raw SQL queries when you need to do something complex that runs quickly? A library is the fastest way to build slow queries. Raw SQL is the slowest way to build fast queries. If you need a query that's fast, sometimes you have to resort to that. Skyward Dev says, as a DBA, are you required to understand the data storage laws of all the regions in which your company has database servers running, or are most of those things handled for you? That's what your security, legal, and compliance teams should be for. You as a DBA, you may be responsible for understanding the kinds of data that you have, and you would present that to your security and compliance teams. They would be the ones to help work with you to architect a strategy to protect it carefully. Sometimes I know people who will say the DBA needs to know that. I don't think that you're going to know the laws of all the countries, and you sure as hell won't understand how to apply them. That's what lawyers and security teams are for. Zaki says, I'm really confused on why these sleep and wait for commands exist. When would you need to hard code a delay? Great example, SP Blitz first. I take a sample of a bunch of your weight stats, wait for 5 seconds, take another sample, and I tell you what the difference was between those 2 times. Other examples, if you have a process that needs to run on a queue, that you want it to continuously run the same query, but you need to inject some delays between those to make sure that you don't overwhelm the SQL Server, a wait for can be good for that. Especially with Google, the term exponential backoff. There's a design pattern called exponential backoffs where you run a query. If no results are found, you wait 1 second. If no results are found, you wait 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 8 seconds, and so forth. Wait fors are great for that. Bob says, what would you like Microsoft to change before releasing CUs? The documentation. The documentation in current CUs would be unacceptable for me if I was looking at the README for Angry Birds. If Angry Birds came out with READMEs this crappy, I would be pissed at Angry Bird developers. The documentation we're getting CUs is unacceptable for software that costs $2,000 to $7,000 a core. It is BS. As an example, the most recent SQL Server 2017 cumulative update that came out put out documentation that was incorrect. And the only reason we got it changed is I blogged about it and a Microsoft person read my blog and said, you're right, that documentation is wrong. If they can't get a 2-sentence piece of documentation right, they need to hit the brakes and learn how to write basic documentation before they ship enterprise quality software where people are using it for dispensing medications, tracking where ambulances are, tracking where police cars are. That level of documentation is utterly unacceptable. I'm going on a rant on there. I'm this close to publishing my next blog post on brentozar.com is going to be about why you should stop applying SQL Server updates until Microsoft gets their act together. I'm pissed. Next up, Yummy says, how can we automate replicated logins being moved to different replicas? DBA Tools. I mentioned DBA Tools IO earlier, that they have a great set of scripts to help you accomplish that. And I wouldn't expect it to be built into the product because you may need different logins on different replicas for other uses as well. Next up, Daniel says, how can you get wait stats for a previously executed query? The plan stored in cache is estimated, so that's not the place to look. One way you could kind of think of is Query Store. Query Store will kind of sort of get you there, but 2019 has a new feature for this that's kind of cool. So with SQL Server 2019, last actual plan, SQL Server has a new trick. It's probably, oh yeah, Grant's post has probably got it in there. So this is a new database scoped configuration that will let you turn on the last actual plan and see that inside the plan cache. I'm going to copy paste that out, and then I'm going to go run it over in SQL Server. So I'm going to go run it. I've run it on my SQL Server now. Now I'm going to go run a query, select top 101 star from DBO users, order by reputation ascending. Go execute that. Then when that finishes, I'm going to go over to and run SP Blitz cache in another window. And now when I go look at the queries in the plan cache, if I go click on the query plan, now I get actual numbers. I can see actual numbers, estimated and actual numbers for everything inside the plan cache. If I right click on here and go into properties, I get query time stats and memory grant info that's actual. I don't get wait stats yet. I wouldn't be surprised if they added wait stats. I actually thought it was in there. I'm kind of surprised that it didn't. Let's try, that one may not have should have had at least SQL. Yeah, so it may not have wait stats yet. Maybe they'll add it, but that would be one way I would also go into. Query Store would probably be the first way, though. All right, let's go switch over to here. And we have, let's see here, the last couple. I'll just go hit a couple random ones. Drop Table Employee says, persisted computed columns blew my mind on one of Brent's training classes. Woohoo! Glad you liked it. SQL Jazz says SSRS That's not even a question. Oh, SSRS on the same server or on its own. We've always split it, but a vendor recently recommended on the same server. What they may have recommended is because SSRS doesn't use that many resources, they might have said like, oh, why don't you just put it on the same SQL server because you can cut your licensing expenses. That, of course, depends on whether you're licensing the whole VM host or whether you're licensing per each individual VM. Khaled says, DJ Khaled's in the house. Thanks. Oh, another one. Just love this guy. Will async network I/O show up if network has PCs with different network card speeds? It can. It can also show up if the computers are very far apart. Like I have one client where their SQL servers in Chicago and their app servers are in Mexico. And so even if they have good network cards, you're still going to see async network I/O. Kelvin says, that's a very nice view. It would be a lot nicer if it wasn't for the rain and the fires, but okay. And then we'll take one more. Let's see here. One more. Veteraj says, I am a SQL Server developer working. I guess that's good. I mean, you could be not working. You wouldn't want to tell your boss that. I guess you're at Twitch. You're not really working. Or YouTube, I suppose. If I'm asked to work in Azure someday, will there be anything new in SQL Server to learn? Please advise. There will always be something new to learn. That's kind of what the parts that I love about technology is that the stuff's always changing. I don't ever want to learn a new programming language. Like I don't want to learn actual languages either. I just don't like languages for some reason. Yeah, there's always going to be something to learn. It just never ends. That's kind of the fun thing with technology. If you like learning, technology is an incredible place to be. The more you learn, the more you earn. Woo! I'm sure someone said that before me, but that's just how it is. All right, one last shout out to this week's sponsor. So Quest is running a totally free set of webcasts this week over at brentozar.com/go/training days. On Wednesday, you can learn from me about filtered indexes, indexed computed columns, and index views, computed columns, and filtered indexes. That's the other one. So it'll be about an hour long of totally free training. You can go see it over there. If you want to catch me the next time I do one of these question and answer sessions, just subscribe or follow on Twitch. Follow on Twitch or subscribe on YouTube, and I will see y'all next time. Hope you had fun and learned something. I will see you later. Adios.